Unbuilt Grace. All companies, institutions, and organizations like to tout their advancements and achievements as they take their places in the sun. Grace Church in Providence is certainly no different. Anyone who has read the history written about the parish during its first century of existence, or investigated events in the nearly 100 years since then, knows that there have been numerous changes and alterations. Even folks who have attended services at Grace just within the past 10 years are aware of changes that have taken place. Our beloved pavilion at Grace, for example, is simply the most recent of these. For this presentation, however, we thought we would switch the focus. Instead of concentrating on the additions that have been built, we will take a look at alterations and additions that have been planned, but for whatever reason or reasons, have either never been started or have been greatly altered in scope. Hence the presentation title, Unbuilt Grace. The 5 plans we will highlight span more than 100 years, beginning in the late 19th century and reaching into the present one. Part 1, the Parish House. We begin by looking at a plan for a new parish house presented to the parishioners in 1891. This illustration is of a poorly repaired brochure found in the Grace Church archives located at the University of Rhode Island in Kingston. It depicts an architect's rendering of the proposed 4-story addition. Facing Chapel Street, the new structure was intended to substantially increase the amount of meeting room space available to the many groups that called Grace Church home. It's important to remember that in the age before movies, radio, television, and the internet, social gatherings at church were a big part of weekly life for many people. Groups were organized for individuals of all ages and genders, for entertainment as well as for instruction. There were classrooms needed for parish Sunday school and Bible studies, as well as for community opportunities, such as English classes for newly arrived immigrants. Space was also required by social workers to help in addressing neighborhood needs and for members of the clergy to use in pastoral counseling. One of the common themes throughout the first century of Grace Church history seemed to be the ongoing need to rent space in nearby buildings, both for offices and meeting rooms. The floor plans for each level reveal the late 19th century solution for the lack of space. Meeting rooms, labeled here as societies, appear on different levels of the proposed structure. The rector and his secretary each have new offices, and apartments have thoughtfully been provided on the top floor for the assistant rector and for the sexton. The proposed plan, however, would create one casualty. The beloved 1857 chapel at the rear of the church would have to be removed. Mention is made in the brochure that stones from the chapel would be utilized in the new construction. Further along, parishioners could read how additional floors might be added at some later date to increase the structure's capacity by 50%. This clearly suggests that whatever space arrangements Grace could establish would only be adequate for a limited time. Eventually, the needs of the ever-expanding parish would surely overwhelm them. This design plan was never carried out. One possible reason for this may be revealed in a letter written in March 1891 by the rector at the time, the Reverend Charles Babcock, to the wardens and vestry. The letter reads in part, quote, "The committee appointed by you to process preliminary plans and estimates for the proposed parish rooms is evenly and, I think, hopelessly divided in opinion concerning the location of the rooms in relation to the chapel. every member of the committee has decided to retire. I, therefore, as a member of your committee, hereby tender my resignation and ask to be relieved from further consideration of the subject." Unquote. According to the Grace Church history book, it may have been about a year later when someone determined that a second floor could easily be added above the chapel for far less cost than erecting a completely new structure. The estimate for the proposed parish house had been $50,000. The closely figured cost for adding the second floor, $16,613.46, was quoted during an April 1892 vestry meeting. The idea was adopted, and construction of this floor was completed later in the year. The additional space provided was evidently sufficient for the parish needs at that time. It would be nearly 20 years before the present chancel enlargement was achieved, and much of the current parish house was built. Part 2, the chapel. Our second example of unbuilt grace involves a proposed chapel. When the chancel was enlarged to its present configuration in 1912, it spelled the end of the 1857 chapel. Located in the back of the church along Chapel Street, the structure, which had survived the threat of destruction in 1891, finally succumbed to the plans of Graham, Goodhue, and Ferguson. What we today refer to as the Chapel of the Messiah was built at this time. Because of its small size, the space eventually came to be identified as a prayer shrine. Around the year 1932, the Reverend Dr. William Appleton Lawrence, then rector, proposed building a proper chapel in one half of the narthex. Dr. Lawrence's chapel entrance was on the right, immediately after entering through the main doorway from Westminster Street. The chapel would extend through the adjacent room at the foot of the west aisle, where stairs lead up to the gallery organ loft. The archives at the University of Rhode Island did not contain a plan of this design, but this sketch, prepared for this presentation, gives the general layout. In 1936, Dr. Lawrence's plan was expanded by the architectural firm of Howe and Prout to extend all the way through the exterior wall of the church and across the adjacent alleyway to the wall of the Albee Theater, which was next door at the time. The left-hand portion of the narthex in this plan has been labeled library. This concept was modified yet again in 1937 to include an extension running south along the alleyway, creating an L-shaped chapel. As we can see by the architect's late 1930s illustration, this addition greatly contributed to the spacious feel of the chapel, especially with the gallery above what was referred to as the ambulatory. A large glazed screen was proposed to separate the chapel from the church, and there was a doorway up near the altar directly into the nave. A 1939 revision of this plan featured a new Gothic-style facade and doorway directly into the chapel from Westminster Street, between the church's main entrance and the Albee Theater. One of the most striking features of this proposal was the large rose window above the entry. By 1939, a wealthy parishioner had deposited $25,000 with the vestry to cover the cost of this chapel. Alas, with the outbreak of World War II, this parishioner expressed grave reservation about the wisdom of building in wartime, fearing the entire church could possibly be destroyed. People today might be surprised at such a strong feeling, but it's worth remembering that the horror of the first years of the conflict in Europe left Americans nervously wondering what might happen next. No one knew for sure. To her credit, the parishioner declined the offer by the vestry to have her funds returned, instead recommending the sum be left in an endowment account. Grace Church, of course, survived the war and several subsequent ones, and the chapel concept remained alive in many minds. The illustrations of the proposed Westminster Street entrance and the interior sketch appeared periodically in parish material, including issues of the newsletter, the Grace Church Parish Helper. It was noted that by the late 1950s, there had been no fewer than 6 additional chapel studies and modifications. This illustration shows the 1952 version of the side chapel. In this plan, the proposed L shape has disappeared, and the narthex has been returned to its original floor plan. The chapel idea seemed remarkably resilient, having as many lives as a cat in its nearly 30 years of dreams and design variations. That it never came to pass in no way reflects either poor planning or lack of imagination. Quite possibly, as the years rolled by, the apparent need for a chapel simply became less necessary. Part 3, the parish house, again. The third example of unbuilt grace dates from 1946. By now, it should come as no surprise to anyone that Grace was once more running out of space. More and larger meeting rooms were required to handle the demands of a large urban Episcopal parish during what we may now look back upon as the high noon of Grace Church membership and activity and growth of the Episcopal Church overall. Parochial records, circa 1949, for example, show the number of communicants in good standing, as opposed to all baptized members, at 2,692. At the time, Grace Church Providence was the largest Episcopal parish in all New England, even beating out the likes of Christ Church Hartford and Trinity Church Boston. This illustration is of a news photo from a January 1946 Sunday Providence Journal, showing architect Albert Harkness pointing out features on a model of the proposed parish house to the Reverend Dr. Clarence Horner, rector of the parish at that time. Those of you with sharp eyes and good memories may recognize this model from the illustration on the small stewardship flyer that could be found in every pew during 2022. As can be clearly seen, architect Harkness has designed a mini skyscraper addition intended to be built atop the existing 1912 parish house. In order to promote this proposal to the parish, a large format brochure was prepared and distributed for the campaign kickoff early in 1946. Most of the pages included artist renderings of the planned spaces, as well as this sketch of the Chapel Street elevation, as seen from Matheson Street. Of special interest in this proposal was an assembly room/ballroom on the top floor. Judging by the number of meeting rooms depicted in the brochure, this proposed construction was evidently intended to solve the parish's cramped and inadequate space problem once and for all. The estimated price tag, $350,000. There was, however, a slight problem. Immediately following the end of World War II, there was a temporary shortage of both skilled labor and material, especially structural steel. Until these shortages could be resolved, construction could not begin. The year 1946 rolled into 1947, which rolled into 1948, which, well, you get the idea. By the close of the 1940s, the availability of labor and steel had greatly increased. Unfortunately, so had the price of the project. What had first been estimated at $350,000 had risen sharply to nearly $900,000. And with that, Grace's mini skyscraper vanished like the top of the Superman building in a fog. But because the need for additional meeting room space had not gone away, architect Harkness was commissioned to scale back his proposed plans for something that would again be affordable to the parish. His revised plan called for a 2-story addition on the east or Matheson Street side and a 5-story one on the west side. The 2-story addition, which we see today, was built atop the 1912 parish house. Because that 1912 construction already went up 5 floors on the west side, the new extension simply expanded the available square footage. The estimated cost was now below $300,000. Construction began in May 1950, and the new parish house complex was dedicated on November the 6th, 1951. Part 4. Moving the High Altar. Not all Unbuilt Grace projects were as large and complex as a new parish house. The one we'll look at next involves a proposed repositioning of the high altar. To better understand the reasoning behind this proposal, we first need to examine what was taking place in the sacred world. During the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church, under the leadership of Pope John XXIII, embarked upon a program of modernization, which became known as Vatican II. Its purpose was to bring the Church and its ancient rites into the 20th century. While this effort manifested itself in several ways, one of the most notable was the turning of the altar 180 degrees so that the priest would be facing the people during the Mass instead of having his back to them. Some theologians debated the wisdom of this and continue to do so even today. Nonetheless, leadership in the Episcopal Church considered what this change could mean in its own liturgical practice, and many parishes began to follow suit. Around the year 1970, a plan was presented to the vestry of Grace Church showing a potential repositioning of the high altar from the far end of the sanctuary to the center of the chancel. This proposal was drawn up by the Reverend Canon Edward West, sacrist of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. At the time, Canon West was the leading liturgical specialist in the Episcopal Church and had been active in assisting parishes that desired to rearrange their furniture. His plan included modifying the chancel by moving the choir stalls to the rear, where the high altar had been, and by installing an English-style rood screen across the middle of the space. Other smaller changes were also planned, but none of this ever came to pass. The reasons for this have yet to be uncovered in the paper trail. By 1980, however, the idea of moving the high altar had resurfaced. This time, plans were drawn up simply to move the altar forward by 30 inches. Moving the altar away from the wall was intended to allow sufficient room for the celebrant to get behind it and face the congregation without forcing further alterations to the sanctuary. The structural engineer, hired by the local contractor, looked at the plans of Fram, Goodhue, and Ferguson from 1912, made his own inspection, and calculated that repositioning the heavy marble altar would be safely possible. Vestry minutes from their July 8th meeting indicated that the cost for making the altar freestanding would run between $8,000 and $10,000. Ultimately, this plan was never carried out, and the high altar remains tightly up against the back wall of the sanctuary. A less costly solution for Grace Church was the establishment of the present altar table at the foot of the chancel steps, an arrangement which, for the time being at least, seems to suit the needs of this parish and its current style of worship. Part 5, the Pavilion. Parishioners enjoy gathering together in the Pavilion at Grace, the architectural gem built next to the church that was completed in the fall of 2017. Newcomers to the parish, however, may not realize that this space represents the culmination of years of planning and countless earlier design proposals. Before this structure became a reality, much time and not a few resources were spent in the attempt to best utilize the available land while creating the most practical building to fit the needs of the parish. Examining each of these earlier proposals for the pavilion is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's worth looking at one of them, put forth by Centerbrook Architects, the firm responsible for the present structure. As we can see, the glass box design seems very 21st century. It allows copious amounts of natural light to flood in, as well as allowing interior activities to be glimpsed from the outside. The interior extends from the west wall of the church across to the location of the present alcove wall. The exterior wall of the church now becomes an interior wall. While this design provides intense visual interest to the new space, recent experience with this concept in another Rhode Island parish compels us to point out a tricky engineering problem where the ceiling or roof of modern material meets that wall of vintage brownstone. It can be a real challenge to create a tight, waterproof seal along this edge. Expansion and contraction during New England's vast seasonal temperature fluctuations are almost guaranteed to lead to wet spots on the floor. It's worth pointing out here that when Richard Upjohn designed and built our church in 1846, he installed a skylight on the roof above each of the high clerestory windows in the nave. In July of 1969, the vestry voted to have those skylights permanently removed. 123 years of wrestling with leaks and repairs had caused a succession of property committees more than enough headaches. Thankfully, the brilliant designers at Centerbrook Architects stayed at their drawing boards. Their final award-winning proposal, with its architecturally sympathetic Gothic design elements, is that which delights us today. Thanks for spending time with us as we looked back over Grace Church history, acknowledging that even projects never achieved are still part of our story as a parish.